When I was recovering, and the NTSB investigator was calling me and talking to me on the phone, and she said, "Would you be willing to help us with some safety products and to talk about your accident?" And I was like, "Absolutely." And she goes, "Well, that's great, because usually," she goes, "we find when there's someone that survives an accident, it's so much more powerful and gets through so many more pilots." And she goes, "And with CO, nobody ever lives."
Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 90 of the Aviation News Talk podcast. I'm your host, Max Trescott, and you just heard Dan Bass, who passed out from carbon monoxide poisoning on his third flight of the day and somehow survived a crash that occurred while he was still unconscious. And today I'll be sitting down with Dan to talk about the events that led up to his crash, what he's learned since the crash about carbon monoxide poisoning, and what you can do to avoid a similar accident in the future. But first, if you're new to the show, we have a weekly news show that shares pilot safety tips and general aviation news and helps connect you as part of a broader community that's championing general aviation around the world. And if you enjoy the show, please click on the subscribe button on whatever app you're using to listen to the show so that new episodes will download automatically to your phone each week. And after the show, if you find yourself wanting just a little more aviation content, go on out to our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and click on posts. There's also a link to it in the show notes, and if you feel that you get value from this show and you're also in a position to donate a few dollars a month, well, you can sign up to do that right on the Patreon site. Again, that's at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Now here's our conversation with Dan Bass. Now, before we get started, let me first tell you a little bit about Dan Bass. Dan is a flight instructor, and he soloed on his 16th birthday and got his private on his 17th birthday. He owns a small custom manufacturing business in Minnesota, and he flies a Mooney 231. Well, Dan, I'd like to officially welcome you to the Aviation News Talk podcast. We're excited to have you here.
Thanks, Max. I'm excited for you having me.
Well, let's go back to the day of your plane crash, February 2nd, 2017. How did that day start out for you?
Well, it started early in the morning. I had a trip that I had to take from Winona, Minnesota, which is my home base, up to Thunder Bay, Canada. I had some business up there and some meetings scheduled for the day. So at 6:30 in the morning was my planned departure time. And being early February in Minnesota, it was extremely cold out. I had waited for a weather window for this trip because the preceding weeks had been pretty miserable. And we had a nice high-pressure system over the upper Midwest, and it was a beautiful day to fly other than it being very, very cold. So I'd filed IFR to get to Thunder Bay because it was an international flight, and it would just be a little easier to navigate that. This was my first time flying to Canada, and I was not 100% positive I'd done everything right in preparation. I took off, and everything was normal other than it being very, very cold, and was climbing up, and something gets stuck in my eye in the climb out. And I remember blinking and trying to rub my eye, and I thought, well, I wonder if it's carbon monoxide. And I turned my heater off to see if it would remedy the eye problem. And I got cold really quick, fast realized that, that's not a symptom of carbon monoxide. So I turned the heater back on and then kept rubbing my eye, and it went away. I climbed up to 10,000 feet on the first leg, and the second leg was a turn eastbound where I went up to 11,000 and sort of caught the corner of Lake Superior. When I was up at that altitude, I got up my pulse oximeter, checked my O2 sats, and I remember thinking, well, they're higher than they normally are, so I'm doing good. And I was happy with that, and I continued on. And the last 10 minutes of the flight, 15 minutes maybe, I got a really slight headache. Now, I normally start the day with caffeine, and I didn't this morning because I was in a rush to get out to the airport. And I just assumed I was kind of getting a caffeine headache. Once I landed in Thunder Bay, I called the customs, as I was instructed to. I spoke with them on the phone the day before and told them when I landed. And they acted a little bit confused, and they said, when? And I said, well, just a few minutes ago at such and such a time. And I hadn't realized that Thunder Bay was on Eastern time zone, not Central, which was totally against everything I had guessed. I didn't even look into it because they're quite a bit west of Chicago, and Chicago's Central, so I just assumed. And so I had inadvertently told customs the wrong time when I landed, and that was their apprehension. They were expecting me at a certain time, and here I was an hour later, and then telling them I arrived on time. So I secured the airplane and sprinted into the FBO just because it was so cold outside. And when I got inside was when I found out that I was on Eastern time and not Central time. And at this time, I started to get a bit of anxiety feeling, kind of butterflies. I can't really explain it better than that. And I attributed that feeling to the anxiety of making sure I'm clearing customs. Here I'm thinking I did something wrong and they might, come rolling in with the with the lights blaring, saying I can't come in. That wasn't the case at all, but I justified kind of how I was feeling based on that situation. Then I went, did my business throughout the day, and at lunch I got some coffee, and my headaches throughout the morning had kind of came and went and came and went, and some were stronger than others. But all of this was while I was away from the airplane. And after lunch, everything seemed fine. I felt great. And at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was making my return trip, and I had to fly just a short flight from Thunder Bay to Duluth to clear customs back into the States. And that flight was perfect. It was a beautiful flight. The sun was setting to my west, and I had Lake Superior to the east, and it was smooth, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was just a gorgeous flight. Once I landed, taxied to the ramp where the customs was going to meet me. I got out of the plane, stood up on the wing, and I got a splitting headache instantly when I got out of the airplane. Again, I wasn't quite sure why. I wasn't associating it with the airplane as much as just once I got out of the airplane, I had the headache, and my daughter had been sick the preceding week, and she was only 4, so she couldn't tell us why she was sick. We just knew she wasn't feeling well. And so I just kind of assumed I was getting whatever she had. I ran into the FBO and finished with customs and used the restroom. I called my wife and I told her I would be returning, or I'd be home within an hour, hour and a half. And then I ran back to the plane, got in, and started it. And then once it was started, I got up my iPad and I filed my IFR flight plan. So I was waiting for that to be accepted into the system. I tidied up my cockpit, getting ready for the flight. I put my headlamp on. I always wore a headlamp for night flights, and at this time, the sun had already went down, and it was night. And then I put my flashlight in the seat next to me, and I took my coat off, put it in the back of the plane, and put my hat and gloves on the seat next to me, and was just getting ready for the flight. And once I got notification on my iPad that my flight plan was in the system, I called ground and got my clearance, and everything seemed normal. While I was taxiing out, I had that brief feeling of butterflies again, of kind of anxiety. It was a little stronger than when it was in the morning, and it went away. It only lasted about 10 or 15 seconds, and I taxied out, got to the run-up area, and by this time my headache went away too, so I felt completely fine. I couldn't figure out why I didn't feel well, and nothing had crossed my mind other than that my daughter was sick and I was possibly getting what she had. So I went ahead and did my run up and ran through my flow and my pre-takeoff checklist. Then I kind of got hyper focused. I ran through it a second time and a third time, and I was checking everything, 3, 4 times. And it wasn't until the tower had contacted me and said, "Are you ready for departure?" And I responded with, "Yeah, I will be in a minute." So that kind of kicked me out of my little cycle of doing my checklist. And then I finished up my checklist, and before I called the tower again to say I was ready, they just cleared me for takeoff and a heading to turn 2. So I accepted the clearance and went rolling down the runway. And once I had lifted off and I was reaching for the gear handle to put the gear up, I got another brief episode of those butterflies that had come back. And again, it was very short, it only lasted a few seconds. And I was confused and I wasn't sure what was going on. So I started to turn to the heading that I was assigned. And at this time, I engaged my autopilot and set the heading bug. And I had the airplane trimmed for a climb. I had full throttle, full mixture, full prop, and trimmed for about 105 knots or so. And then I remember talking with the tower over a few traffic callouts. And then when they handed me over to departure, I read that back and I called departure, and then the tower advised me I hadn't switched frequencies. I contacted departure. They gave me cleared direct to my destination on up to 9,000 feet, and I repeated that back. And as I repeated that back, I slurred, and I noticed I slurred, and I was feeling unwell, and I couldn't quite figure out why. and I was thinking I need to return to the airport. But I was real reluctant to change anything because everything was going well, and since I didn't have a handle on what was wrong, I was reluctant to change anything. When they cleared me direct to my destination, which was Winona, I remember putting that into my Garmin 530, and usually it's a muscle memory thing. When I was cleared direct, I'd hit the GPS steer button, and I didn't hit it. The next thing I remember right after that was waking up, and I thought I had dozed off, and I had to tell ATC that I'm okay and I needed to land. So I started to key the mic and was trying to contact ATC, to no avail. And as I was doing that, I realized that my window in front of me was really clear, which shocked me. I always try to make it as clean and as clear as I can, but never with the success I want. And I'm thinking, wow, that looks really good. And then I reached forward to touch it, and I realized it was missing. And then I started to take in my surroundings a little bit, and I realized my airplane was on the ground. It was in a field, and I noticed there was a searchlight in a field about a mile off my right wing. And so immediately I tried to turn on lights on the airplane to make the airplane visible. Incidentally, I had a friend that had an airplane accident at night, and I thought of him immediately. That's how he was found. He was able to turn nav lights on. So I was trying to do that, and nothing was working. And then I realized that my feet were pinned. I thought I had to get out of the plane and try to get to help. And I couldn't, my feet were pinned in the rudder pedals, so I was struggling with that for a while. The other thing was I had the headlamp on when I took off. That wasn't, no, that was missing. And everything I had put on my seat, my hat, my gloves, my cell phone, and my flashlight were gone. I couldn't find anything. So it was real dark in the plane. I was real confused, and I was able to free my feet and kind of crawl out of the plane and then retrieve my coat from the rear seat and put that on. But at this point, I was too cold to zip it up, and I couldn't find my hat or gloves, and so I set off towards where I saw that light, and I was tripping and falling and crawling, and it wasn't very graceful. I did that for a good 100 yards or so, and then kind of just fell down and laid there and was realizing that wasn't working. And after reassessing my surroundings, I looked back at the plane, and past the plane the opposite direction, I saw some structures with a light on an outbuilding. So I made my way back that way through some woods, and fortunately made it to a house where there was a wonderful lady watching TV at night. And I scared her half to death by pounding on her window. Well, that's how I made it to help.
Boy, that's an amazing story. Let me go back and ask you a few questions about the different things that occurred at different stages. Now, when you mentioned that the pulse oximeter showed you had a higher than normal oxygen level, and at the time you kind of thought, hey, that's good, have you subsequently concluded that maybe it was trying to tell you something?
Yeah. So the way those pulse oximeters work is they actually just look at the color of your blood, and the color is dictated by how much oxygen is present. Now, when you are exposed to carbon monoxide, the carbon monoxide molecule binds to that same spot in the hemoglobin that your oxygen would, and it does it with much, much stronger than the oxygen. And so it displaces oxygen and gives you a form of hypoxia. But the pulse oximeter, the color, it actually gets a darker red, and the pulse oximeter can't tell the difference between oxygen and carbon monoxide. And since carbon monoxide actually binds stronger, you're going to have an elevated level. So I was showing probably 5 or 6 points higher than what I normally would at that altitude, and it was because I was being poisoned by carbon monoxide.
Hmm.
So it's important to note that those do not protect at all with carbon monoxide. They help with altitude hypoxia, but not hypoxia that's caused by carbon monoxide poison.
So tell us a little bit about the treatment after you were rescued.
Well, fortunately, my airplane flew itself to the rough vicinity of the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and I was airlifted to Mayo. And once we realized that it was carbon monoxide poisoning, it was about 5 hours after the accident. And one of the doctors was very familiar with the hyperbaric treatments that they have available at Mayo, and they said it's very imperative that I get in hyperbaric treatment within 24 hours of exposure. So I ended up having 3 treatments in the hyperbaric chamber, and that helps purge all of the carbon monoxide out of your system And they believe it helps greatly with reducing the long-term effects of carbon monoxide poisoning.
And have you had any long-term effects that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. If you ask my wife, maybe she'll think of some cognitive problems. But no, I don't think so.
So you had originally emailed me after episode 88 came out, and you said, "Hey, Max, I'm the person who flew that accident airplane that you talked about." And in that show, I mentioned 4 different things that were kind of key takeaways for people to think about for carbon monoxide. And you mentioned that, yeah, you thought you might be able to add to that list now that you had some firsthand experience. So let me just go back and read those, and maybe you can add to that. Let's see. So number 1, know the symptoms, which include headache, dizziness, upset stomach, vomiting, weakness, confusion, and chest pain. Skin is pink or pale and lips bright red. 2, most carbon monoxide in planes is from a faulty heating system, so shut off the cabin heat, open windows, and land as soon as possible. Number 3, 43% of poisoned patients still have cognitive problems a year after their encounter, though I've subsequently read that hyperbaric oxygen chamber treatments help with that. And 4, get an electronic CO detector. So how would you, add or subtract from that list?
Well, I would change the order. So I think the very first thing is to have a digital carbon monoxide detector. Preferably, they have, I call them high resolution ones. They'll read in parts per million, and they'll read from 0 on up. And they make a lot of good portable units. But that's the first thing I would do. The second thing, you should know the symptoms, but you should be aware that I believe that they've been taught to us in aviation kind of incorrectly. At least for me, it led me astray a little bit. I really believed, I was very aware of carbon monoxide poisoning. I was aware of the symptoms, but I always believed that they were very linear. So I would start with a slight headache, and the headache would get worse, and then I would get drowsy or dizzy, or I would, it made me believe that it was something that once you started the symptoms, they progressively got worse. And what I found is, since it is like hypoxia, we all react completely different. And there's no way to really know how you're going to react. My symptoms came and went throughout the day. They're really easy to justify based on the other things going on in my life, with a caffeine headache, or my daughter is sick, or I had the anxiety feeling because of the stress of clearing customs properly. So it's really important to realize that you might not realize the symptoms. It's very likely you might not. The other thing is your cognitive ability is decreased so much from carbon monoxide poisoning, from that forced hypoxia, that by the time you are showing the symptoms, you might not have the ability to really connect the dots.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like, in a sense, you're telling me that it was easy to kind of rationalize all these different clues that maybe you were having carbon monoxide and attribute other explanations to them.
Exactly. Without a carbon monoxide detector, and a good one, you're just at risk to not notice the symptoms, not be able to connect the dots.
So let's talk about carbon monoxide detectors. There are obviously all kinds. What have you figured out through your research?
Well, shortly after my accident, I was participating in a lot of the online forums, particularly Mooney Space and Beach Talk, and they tend to talk about accidents. And I'm laid up in a chair, and I'm reading about myself. So I had to chime in and explain what had happened to me, and everyone was real supportive and wanted to know more. And then the talk turned to detectors. What can we do to protect ourselves? What are the best ones on the market? And I did limited research, but I reached out to a few companies, and one of them was Sensorcon, and they make industrial portable units that are real reasonably priced. And I reached out to them and I said, I've got a group of pilots. We'd like to get a group discount. And I said, but I don't want to buy them all myself. Is there a way we could just call and say we're with a group? And so they gave me a discount code. And I thought we'd have like 20 guys. And that code in the last year and a half has sold over 600 of these. So the response has been phenomenal. And there are lots of good units out on the market. And this is just one particular one. I think any of the low-level, high-resolution detectors that are digital are going to work really, really well. Then the other options are a panel mount unit, and Guardian Avionics makes the panel mount carbon monoxide detectors that many of us are familiar with, and they have also offered a discount. I personally believe that the best line of defense is having 2 of them. In aviation, we like redundancy. So I have a Guardian in my panel, and I have a Sensorcon that's Velcroed on my panel. I can cross-check them both, and I have that redundancy there in case one of them doesn't work.
Yeah, and I read a study that was done out of Wichita State, as I recall, where they determined that locating something on the panel was one of the best places to locate it. Let's talk about chemical patches. What's your feeling about those?
Well, they're not they're definitely not the solution. They they technically work, but they have a short shelf life. Most of the there's two different types, of my understanding, and the biochemical one has like a 3 month shelf life, and I think the other one's only 30 days. So they're really inexpensive, but you have to replace them. You have to be careful. They can be damaged by cleaners that I guess are generally used in the cockpit. Um, and the other big one is you have to look at it and interpret it. In a dark cockpit, I think that would be really difficult. Also, by the time you are getting symptoms, you're not going to maybe look at it and connect the dots at that point. That's where a digital one with an alarm is really important.
Yeah, I think the alarm would be a nice wake up call because I think it'd probably be easy to be, just kind of a little dull, listless, kind of your own little reverie as you're approaching,
Yeah,
sleepiness.
and I felt like when I was taxiing out and I was impaired before I departed Duluth, I felt like I was very suggestible. So I mean, a simple alarm, another person, anything that said, "Hey, are you okay? Do you really want to fly?" Anything would have got me to stop that flight, but I just didn't have that thing blaring in my face. So an alarm is key.
Well, let's talk about home CO monitors. I had an email recently from a pilot who said, well, I can't really afford the industrial types that have sensitivity and give you the low level and so on. But I went down to one of the big box stores like Lowe's or Home Depot and bought a home CO monitor for 25 bucks. What are some of the disadvantages of doing that?
Well, the home ones I discourage people from using. They're certainly better than what I had, which was nothing. So they may have worked in my case, but they're made to a UL standard that is kind of loose. It's meant to operate in your home without going off all the time, giving you false positives. Because there's a lot of natural CO in homes, I'll say. A lot of times, if you have a gas furnace, well, a gas furnace shouldn't give you CO if it's working properly. But a gas stove, any sort of gas appliances can give off CO in houses. Um, Perhaps you have an attached garage, and when you open the door between the house and the garage, you can get small amounts of CO in. So they're made to not go off until they have had a significant level of parts per million for a significant amount of time. Um, and where this is kind of dangerous in aviation is CO has a long half life. It's 5 hours. So if you fly for a few hours and you're being poisoned and you don't know it, and you land and you have lunch, or you land and get a fuel stop, and you're outside the airplane, say for a couple hours, and you get in and you continue, the CO from the first flight, it hasn't left your body completely yet, and so you build on it and it increases for your amount of time. Now, one of those home detectors could possibly not alarm because it isn't hitting its threshold yet for that period of time.
So let's talk about the industrial type detectors, which detect small amounts. How does that become useful even in situations where maybe you're not getting CO poisoning yet in the aircraft?
Yeah, those have turned out to be pretty amazing. Because of this discount, and I've had a lot of people report back to me with what they found with their detector. And we found it's really important to pay attention to the numbers it's telling you and get a baseline for your airplane, figure out what's normal, what's not. Being that we have an internal combustion engine sitting in front of us on an airplane and the exhaust is in front of us, it exits, we're always going to be getting some CO on the plane with ground ops and things like that. And it's important to realize that and know what's normal. And when anything strays from normal, you can investigate. And people have been catching exhaust issues and things much earlier, well before they're an emergency or a danger, but definitely ones that could develop into a bad situation. And that saves money, because if you can fix the exhaust crack or the pinhole in the exhaust at the airport of your choosing, or at your home base, that's a lot better than when you're on the road. And it's more convenient because you're able to schedule maintenance rather than have to do emergency maintenance. But it's been amazing at the amount of things that people have found. And another non-related CO thing for guys that are flying turbos, I had a Mooney Bravo pilot report back that he had his Sensorcon show 200 parts per million during a climb out in IMC, and he declared an emergency and returned to the airport. And maintenance had found that he had a loose V-band clamp on his turbo. So he had enough CO being escaping through that V-band and making its way somehow into the airplane through the firewall or through wing root fairings or something that it alerted him to it. And that's just a fantastic thing that these CO detectors are being able to catch problems like that.
Yeah, a lot of side benefits long before you would find yourself imperiled by CO poisoning. So I'm curious, what was the ultimate determination of where CO was coming in from your airplane?
Well, mine had the classic crack in the muffler, and I had the heat shroud around it, and it had a kind of a fatigue crack right in the middle of it. And on the four-cylinder Moonies, it's a 4-into-1 system with the muffler directly below, and it cracked right down the middle, and that's what poisoned me. It was only 89 hours since the last inspection of the exhaust system, and the exhaust system, by airplane terms, was relatively new. It was just under 10 years old, and it had about 750 hours on it.
Wow. I mean, I would imagine that half the fleet probably has that much time on their exhaust system.
Yeah, on another interesting note, there was one Bonanza owner, a G36 Bonanza owner, that had he got a Sensorcon and was excited to take a look at his airplane. And on the ground, he was able to get a 9 part per million rise when he used his heat. And when it was repeatable. So he turned his heat on, it'd go up 9 parts. He'd turn it off, it'd go back down. And so he knew that there was some CO, very, very small amount. That's not enough to be dangerous at all. But some CO getting in through the heating system, and he had his mechanic pull the exhaust. And sure enough, they found that it was well deformed, I think probably beyond repair, from an internal exhaust fire, and it had a little pinhole in it. So they're amazing tools.
And I read recently that whenever you have a backfire, you ought to have your exhaust system examined because the backfire really stresses the system and could actually cause a breach in it and let CO into the aircraft.
Yeah, and with my particular flight, the flight before this flight, I had a backfire at startup. And that particular airplane I had owned for 6 or 7 years, and I think it's backfired 2 or 3 times in the time I've owned it. And it startled my wife when it happened, and I said, "Oh, it's just a backfire. It's no big deal." So I'm very suspect of that backfire being what either caused the crack or opened the crack up to a point that it was how dangerous it was.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that. Yeah, I think I used to look at backfires as being relatively benign, but since I've done some research on this, I realize those really can be the origin of just this kind of problem.
Exactly. Yeah, it's important to give a good once over afterwards. And that's one thing I love about these carbon monoxide detectors, that they give you the immediate feedback, and you can test the heating system on the ground during run-up as if you test carb heat or anything during your run-up, and get immediate results to the health of that particular heating system at that time. And that's worked into my flow now. So before every flight, or when I'm doing my run-up, my Sensorcon detector goes down by my heat vent, and I turn the heat on, and I watch for the rise in parts per million, and I turn it off, and I want to see 0 all the time.
Boy, that sounds like a really good addition to anybody's pre-takeoff checklist. And I guess that heating systems aren't the only source of CO in aircraft. So what do you know about that?
Well, after my accident, I had been doing a lot of research and digging into all the accidents in the past 30 or 40 years. And the FAA did a study where they looked at all the data, and only half of all the carbon monoxide accidents were caused by faulty heating systems. So like I'd mentioned earlier, when we have an internal combustion engine with an exhaust that exhausts ahead of us, it can find other ways into the cabin. And it's important to be aware of that it isn't just winter flying and heaters. So this can happen geographically anywhere at any season.
Well, as we start to wrap up here, any final thoughts you have you'd like to share with pilots?
Yeah, well, some of the other things that I learned from this crash was about crashing itself, and it's got me to think about it a lot. When you crash an airplane, things aren't where you normally put them. They move around, and you probably won't find them. So a lot of times things that we have for emergency equipment maybe aren't attached to us or aren't firmly attached to the airframe, but they're with us. They're not necessarily going to be of use. I was real close to being trapped in my airplane, and so I only had what was within reach. And I didn't have much. I couldn't find my phone. I couldn't find my flashlights. And I found in that situation, my avionics weren't working. Communication is the key, and you want to be able to communicate, whether it's call someone with your cell phone, whether it's use an aviation handheld radio to talk to that airplane or helicopter that's flying overhead looking for you, or use a strobe light or a flashlight or a signal mirror. Any of these things should be on your person or firmly attached to the airframe within reach, because there's a good chance you're not going to be able to get out of the plane. Another takeaway was use ATC as much as you can. I know I've heard a lot of people talk about, well, with ADS-B now, I don't see a need to get flight following, or I don't see a need for talking to ATC because everyone can see me and I can see everyone. Well, we all know there's some holes in that theory right now, but I was IFR when I didn't need to be, and when I when they lost contact with me, they tried really hard to get in touch with me the whole time I was flying. And by the time my airplane ran out of gas, not even before it crashed, but by the time it ran out of gas, all the search and rescue was underway for me. And that only happened because of ATC and the services they provide. So I encourage anyone to use ATC as much as possible.
Yeah, for example, we had talked earlier about a helicopter that was in the area. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so just briefly, I lost consciousness only about 4.5 minutes after departure. And fortunately, I had everything full forward, full mixture. So in the climb, my airplane was trimmed for climb, and I'm not with it anymore. It was only able to climb up to about 12,500 feet. Now, if I would have had it leaned at all, it not only would have went higher, which would have been detrimental because I was oxygen starved, but it would have stayed up a lot longer because it would have burned less gas and I would have flew further. So I was really lucky in that case that I didn't change anything and that my airplane couldn't physically fly any higher because of the full rich mixture. But as I flew along, it was an hour and a half before the airplane ran out of gas in the selected tank. And ATC was watching me and clearing the way the whole time. And as I was running out of gas, after I ran out of gas and was descending, it's my understanding that there was a medical helicopter in the air in the Twin Cities region as I was flying over, and they were returning back to their base after refueling. And ATC advised them that there was an airplane with an unresponsive pilot flying southbound. And that helicopter then turned and came towards me, and ultimately was the helicopter that picked me up. So they were in the air en route before my airplane even hit the ground.
Well, Dan, I am so incredibly happy that you survived your airplane crash, and I think we can all learn a tremendous amount from what you experienced. So thank you so very much for sharing with us here today what you learned.
Well, thank you, Max. I encourage everybody to talk about it around the airport lounges and get everybody to get a carbon monoxide detector. Accidents with carbon monoxide, as you pointed out in your show, episode 88, about one a year, right? And these should be as simple as not running out of gas. By having a detector, it just shouldn't happen anymore.
Well, hopefully we'll get that number down near to zero. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you, Max. I really appreciate it.
Well, not many people can say they survived a plane crash while they were unconscious. He was incredibly lucky. By the way, after Dan and I finished the interview, we continued to talk for a while, and you can hear part of that conversation at the very end of this episode. And if you want to buy a carbon monoxide detector, you'll find a number of them mentioned in the show notes, though it doesn't appear the discounts Dan mentioned are still available. To get to the show notes, just tap on the artwork on the podcast player on your smartphone or go to our website at aviationnewstalk.com. Also, please check out our Patreon site and consider becoming a supporter of the show. We had 2 supporters drop out so far this month for various reasons, so if you'd like to take one of their places, visit the Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And as regular listeners of the show know, if you think that someday you might buy a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me today so I can help arrange a free demo flight if you're thinking of a new Cirrus and help you understand the many factors involved in buying new versus used Cirrus. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And finally, please do me one favor. Take just one moment to show your aviation friends how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they're not familiar with what a podcast is, just send them to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store on their smartphone to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast apps for iOS and Android. To get the app, just go to the App Store for your phone and do a search for Aviation News Talk. And yes, of course, the apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. Super. Well, Dan,
Awesome.
all I can say is thank you very, very much for having contacted me, because I think you have such an important story. I think people learn so much more from firsthand telling of stories like this than any research that I could read. Plus, you've now lived this and breathed it literally, and so far more about it than I do. So
when I was recovering, and the NTSB investigator was calling me and talking to me on the phone, and she said, "Would you be willing to help us with some safety products and to talk about your accident?" And I was like, "Absolutely." And she goes, "Well, that's great, because usually," she goes, "we find when there's someone that survives an accident, it's so much more powerful and gets through to so many more pilots." And she goes, "And with CO, nobody ever lives."
Yeah, jeez.
And so that was one thing I wanted to bring up too, which I didn't. You'd put a link to that FAA bulletin or the FAA flyer about a similar crash that happened 20 years before in Missouri with a Comanche, where the pilot was fine. He walked away. I reached out and spoke to him, and what was interesting, I kind of interviewed him just for my own. He says he does not recall having any symptoms at all.
Jeez.
And he just was lights out. So that sort of reaffirmed my theory that everybody's so different on how we react that we just don't know.
Right.